Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're cracking open the official playbook for private security in Texas. We're going to decode the high-stakes, split-second decisions they have to make about using force, and this is all coming straight from the state's own training manual. So let's just jump right in with the big question, right? In the heat of the moment, when can a security officer actually and legally use force? What is guiding that critical decision? Well, before we can even get into their powers, we got to know exactly who we're talking about. The Texas Occupations Code is super specific here. A security officer isn't just a guy in a uniform. They are officially employed to do guard duties for a specific security company or a private business. And, that distinction is absolutely crucial because their authority is tied directly to that job and that property, not to the public in general. Here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll cover the basic rules of force. Then, we'll walk through the step-by-step guide they're trained to use. It's called the Force Continuum. After that, we'll look at the incredibly high standard for using deadly force, and we'll clear up their arrest powers, which are probably more limited than you think. And finally, we'll get into the serious consequences for when they get it wrong. All right, let's kick it off with Section 1, the basic rules of force. This is all about the mindset, the thinking that has to happen before any action is taken. Every single decision an officer makes is going to be judged by two critical legal ideas. So the first idea is this thing called the totality of the circumstances. It sounds complicated, but it just means you have to look at the entire picture. An officer has to consider everything in that moment. The location, if there are weapons, how many people are involved, even things like their size and strength. Literally every detail counts. And that leads us straight to the second, and honestly, the most important standard. It comes right out of the Texas Penal Code. It says force is justified only when an officer reasonably believes it's immediately necessary. Now, I want you to really focus on that phrase, reasonably believes. That's the cornerstone of this entire topic. It's the legal test that determines if what they did was justified or if it was illegal. Okay, so how does an officer take that idea of reasonable belief and actually use it in a situation that's getting more and more tense? Well, that's where the force continuum comes in. This is the main framework every single security officer in Texas is trained to use. The training manual actually has a fantastic way of explaining this. It's not some rigid ladder you have to climb one step at a time. It's much more like an elevator. An officer might have to jump on at the top floor depending on the threat, right? But the goal always is to de-escalate, to bring the situation back down to the ground floor. So what does this elevator look like? Well, it has 5 levels. It starts at the very bottom with just officer presence, the uniform itself. Then it moves up to verbal commands, then what they call soft hand techniques, and then hard intermediate weapons, like baton. The whole point is that each level is just a reaction to what the other person is doing, with deadly force being the absolute very last resort. All right, let's put this to the test. Here's a question straight from the official state exam. True or false, a security officer can use force just because someone is yelling at them or insulting them? What do you think? And the answer is a big, clear false. And this really gets to a huge limit on their power. The Texas Penal Code says it outright. Words alone, no matter how nasty, are never a justification for getting physical. An officer is trained to just deflect and de-escalate. So this brings us to the very top floor of that elevator, and obviously the highest stakes. Section 3, justifying deadly force. Because this is literally a life or death decision, it's got its own set of super strict, very specific rules. The law is incredibly specific here, and there's no wiggle room. For self-defense or for protecting somebody else, deadly force is justified only to stop another person from using deadly force themselves, or to prevent one of 4 specific violent crimes from happening right then and there: aggravated kidnapping, murder, sexual assault, or robbery. That's it. That is the whole list. And hey, if you think that's strict, check out the rules for protecting property. They're even tighter. Deadly force is only an option to prevent arson, burglary, or robbery. And for something like theft, get this, it has to be happening at night. And even then, it's only allowed if there's literally no other way to protect the property. Okay, now we're going to tackle one of the biggest myths about private security. Section 4, arrest powers and limits. And here's the absolute most important thing you need to remember. A security officer has the authority of a private citizen, not a police officer.
The manual really hammers this point home again and again. A security officer is not a peace officer. Their authority stops at the property line. They can't pull a car over, and this is a big one. They must obey any command from a sworn police officer on the scene. Oh, and pretending to be a peace officer, that's actually a crime.
So, what does all this mean for making an arrest? Well, it means a security officer's power to arrest is exactly the same as yours or mine. It's what's known as a citizen's arrest, and honestly, its limits might surprise you.
And here it is, straight from the law. A citizen's arrest is only legal without a warrant if a felony or a breach of the peace, like a big public fight, is happening right in front of them. It has to happen in their presence, in their view. That is a really, really high bar to clear. And all of this leads to our last and maybe most important section. So what happens when an officer gets it wrong? Section 5, crossing the line, and what the real-world consequences look like. When an officer uses force the wrong way, they can face two different kinds of legal trouble. First, there's criminal liability. That's when the state itself presses charges, which could lead to fines or even prison time. And then there's civil liability. That's when the person who got hurt sues the officer, their company, and maybe even the client they were working for a lot of money. And the manual is very clear about the kinds of things that can land an officer in hot water. We're talking about everything from using way too much force and illegal intimidation to making a bad arrest, even just carrying a weapon you're not supposed to have, or, again, acting like a cop can get you into some serious legal trouble. But at the end of the day, it all boils down to this one single, pretty sobering quote from the manual. An officer has a split second to make a decision based on their training and what they reasonably believe. But months, maybe even years later, a judge or a jury will have the final say as to whether or not you acted reasonably. So when you look at this whole system, the rules of force, the limited authority, the very real consequences, it leaves us with a pretty important question. As we see more and more private security everywhere, in malls, in office buildings, in our neighborhoods, where do we as a society draw that line between protection and power?